Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepless Scientist, a quiet place in the cosmos where your thoughts can unwind and knowledge becomes a soft lullaby for the night. Tonight's journey will take us into the possibility that time may have more layers than we usually feel, and that echoes from the future might already be brushing gently against our present. But before you settle in and get cozy, I'd love if you could take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Only if you truly find these quiet explorations enjoyable. And when you're ready, leave a comment to let me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always a joy to see all the places we gather from, each resting in a different corner of the night. Now, feel free to dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's gently begin our journey into the strange, delicate idea of temporal echoes together. And if your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let it drift. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. If you pause for a moment and listen to the world around you, the slow breathing of the night, the faint rustle of leaves outside, or perhaps the gentle ticking of a clock, you might notice something curious. Time in our everyday lives seems simple. It moves forward. It carries us from one moment to the next, like a river that never turns back. And yet, for as long as people have been watching the sky, telling stories and wondering who we are, there has always been a quiet suspicion that the river might not be as linear as we think. That sometimes, at the edges of our experience, something from another moment, perhaps far ahead, leans close enough for us to feel it. This suspicion appears in myths, in old folk tales, and in the strange accounts of people who swear they've seen or felt something that didn't quite belong to the present moment. And although science tends to hold a stricter line, many researchers quietly admit that time is far stranger than the version we use in daily life. Not frighteningly strange, but delicately, almost poetically strange. The way a reflection in water seems perfectly still until you look closely and see ripples shifting the image in subtle ways. You don't need equations or diagrams to sense this. Sometimes it's as simple as noticing that something familiar arrives too early, or a detail feels slightly misaligned, as if the moment has borrowed a hint from somewhere ahead. There are days when you meet a person who seems to know what you are about to say, or you walk into a place you've never been and feel a puzzling sense of recognition. These moments are usually explained by memory, coincidence, or imagination. And most of the time, those explanations are enough. But every so often, one of those moments lingers. It clings to the mind like a whisper caught in the fabric of the day, and you wonder if something else might be happening just beneath the surface. Scientists sometimes describe time as a landscape rather than a line, a place where past, present and future might exist at once, like pages of a book already printed, even if you're only reading one. That doesn't mean we can step from one page to another, but it opens the door to gentle possibilities. Perhaps in rare situations or subtle ways, a trace from a different page drifts into ours. Not a message, not a warning, just an echo. A soft impression that doesn't seek to change anything, only to exist quietly in the background. Stories of temporal echoes often begin with small things. An object that seems too advanced for the age in which it was made. A phrase someone writes years before the concept becomes common knowledge. A sketch or idea that arrives centuries before the technology to build it. These anomalies don't always point to time travel. Many have ordinary explanations once we look closely. But the emotional impact they leave, the sense that the future might be brushing lightly against the past, remains strangely persistent. Imagine time as a fabric stretched across a frame. Most of the time it lies smooth, but occasionally with enough pressure or movement small wrinkles appear. At those wrinkles, different moments can draw slightly closer, not touching, just nearing enough for something faint to pass through. Light, maybe. A thought. A coincidence that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Not a loud disruption, just a shimmer. Even in the natural world, echoes often appear without sound. A reflection bouncing off a window can make you think someone is standing behind you when no one is there. A delayed signal in a cable can make a device flicker at the wrong moment. A memory can surface unexpectedly and make it feel as though 2 points in time have overlapped for a heartbeat. Perhaps temporal echoes, if they exist, feel something like this: quiet, fleeting, and easily missed, unless you're already leaning toward the thought that time has more depth than its surface reveals. Tonight, as we wander through the questions surrounding future chrononauts, travellers who might exist ahead of us, we're not trying to prove anything. Instead, we're gently exploring the possibility that time may leave traces, the way wind leaves patterns in sand or the ocean leaves foamy lines on the shore. Whether those traces come from the far future, the deep past, or simply from the complexity of the universe itself, noticing them can be a comforting reminder that reality is richer and more layered than our daily routines suggest. As we drift a little deeper into this journey, we'll look at stories, objects, and ideas that seem to sit just outside the boundaries of ordinary time. Some are mysterious, some unexpectedly poetic, and all of them invite us to slow down and consider the possibility that time is not only something we move through, it might also be something that occasionally reaches back toward us. There is something quietly mesmerizing about walking through an old museum late in the afternoon, when the sunlight grows softer and the sounds of the day begin to fade. Glass cases become a little dimmer, the floors a little quieter, and every artifact sits in a gentle stillness, as if the past itself is taking a slow breath. In that stillness, a person can begin to imagine how different eras might, just for a moment, brush against one another. And sometimes, among the pottery shards, weathered tools, and ancient inscriptions, there are objects that seem to whisper a question. Why are you here? These are the curiosities that feel a little too advanced, a little too precise, a little too out of place for the time that made them. The Antikythera mechanism is perhaps the most famous of these quiet puzzles. Recovered from a shipwreck more than a century ago, at first it seemed like a lump of corroded bronze. Only later did researchers discover tiny interlocking gears inside, layers upon layers of them, calculated with a precision that feels almost modern. When examined with gentle lighting and high-resolution scans, the mechanism resembles a miniature galaxy of metal teeth, each one crafted to turn with the soft reliability of a clock. It predicted positions of planets and eclipses, tracing celestial rhythms as if its maker wanted to hold a piece of the universe in their hands. To historians, it is a remarkable artifact of ancient genius. To dreamers, it is something more, a gleam of future craftsmanship, arriving centuries before the world was ready for it. If someone wished to imagine a temporal echo, this mechanism is an object that could invite that thought without saying a word. There are many other pieces like this, though they live in the shadows of museums rather than in headlines. A vase with a glaze too vivid for the techniques supposedly available, a figurine carved with a geometry more refined than the tools of its era should permit. The so-called Baghdad battery, whose structure resembles the kind of simple electrochemical device children make in school today. The Dorchester pot found inside rock layers far older than the artifact appears to be. Each item has explanations, most of them mundane, some more confident than others. Yet when people encounter them, they occasionally feel a stirring. Did someone somewhere know something before they should have? Part of this is human nature. We are drawn to puzzles, especially those that tug gently on the fabric of what we believe is possible. Another part is the timeless desire to feel connected to something larger than our short span of years. And perhaps most of all, these artifacts remind us that the past was not silent. People then wondered, invented, struggled and experimented in ways that still surprise us. Still, every so often, there is an artifact that resists an easy explanation. It stands there, quietly, shimmering with the sense that it has slipped through a crack, just slightly, between what the historical record says we should find and what actually lies in front of us. When we look at such things, we often feel as though time has blinked, the way a reflection on a lake shimmers when a breeze passes across its surface. Even if time itself never folds enough to let travellers cross from one century to another, our understanding of history is full of these delicate folds, moments when knowledge seems to jump ahead, then vanish, a design that reappears thousands of years later, a technique forgotten for centuries before resurfacing, a concept scratched into stone that scholars spend decades trying to decode. These are not necessarily signals from the future, yet they fit comfortably into the poetic idea that time leaves threads behind, threads that pull at our curiosity. Imagine for a moment how knowledge might drift through generations. A craftsperson in an ancient workshop might stumble upon a design through trial, intuition, or a spark of inspiration. They carve or shape or weld something that no one else around them fully understands. Their apprentice tries to replicate it and fails. The design vanishes again, like a shoreline washed smooth by a rising tide. And then, centuries later, engineers rediscover the same pattern through mathematics and physics, believing they are the first to see it. This rhythm, advanced disappearance rediscovery, can feel almost like the flicker of a temporal echo. It is not proof, of course, but it offers a comforting thought. Time may have its own way of letting ideas drift, even when people forget where they came from. Sometimes the earliest pioneers appear not at the dawn of a technological revolution, but in a quiet corner of history where someone simply had the right idea centuries too early. One of the reasons these objects captivate us is because they make the timeline look less like a straight line and more like a meandering path. They remind us that progress is uneven, that brilliance appears in unexpected places, and that innovation does not always follow the rules we expect. And in that unevenness, some people feel the faint suggestion of something more, a sense that time might occasionally fold just enough for a detail, a shape, or an idea to slip through. As we move further into this journey, these artifacts serve as gentle companions. They don't shout for attention. They sit quietly in the dim corners of our museums and our imaginations, inviting us to look again, to wonder again, to consider that time may have patterns we have not learned to see yet. Whether they are true echoes from the future, or simply the bright sparks of human creativity appearing earlier than expected, their presence makes our exploration richer, softer, and far more intriguing. They are small windows into the mystery of how ideas travel, and perhaps how moments might whisper to one another across the centuries. There's a certain feeling that drifts through old biographies and handwritten journals, a soft unease that settles in when you encounter someone who seems just a little too advanced for their time. Not in the dramatic, world-changing sense, but in subtle ways that make you pause and wonder how a person living centuries ago could think thoughts that feel strangely modern, or create ideas that should have belonged to a distant future. These are the individuals who seem to stand slightly out of step with the era around them, as if a faint breeze from another century touched their shoulders before slipping quietly away. It begins with the small things, a sketch of a machine centuries before its time, a scientific intuition that appears without precedent, a phrase that reads like it was lifted from a far more modern understanding of nature. We often explain these mysteries through genius, or through the natural tendency for ideas to drift and reappear, and most of the time those explanations fit comfortably. But every so often, one of these figures feels different, like a quiet anomaly in the flow of history. Take Leonardo da Vinci, for instance. His notebooks unfold like a conversation with a world that did not exist yet. Flying machines shaped like giant wings, armoured vehicles, hydraulic pumps, and swirling diagrams of aerodynamics before the language for such things had even formed. People often call him a visionary, and he was. Yet when reading his sketches, some feel the faint impression of someone leaning forward in time, catching glimpses of inventions far beyond the tools and materials at his disposal. There is nothing supernatural in his work, only the unusual sensation that he was tuned to a frequency others could not hear. And then there is Nikola Tesla, a man who lived in a later era yet still carried the air of someone misplaced. His writings describe wireless communication, global energy grids, precise remote control, and even ideas resembling early thoughts on autonomous systems, visions that would take generations to become real. Tesla claimed these ideas arrived fully formed, like sudden sparks. He didn't explain how. He simply wrote what came to him, as though he were transcribing something whispered from a distant tomorrow. Stories like these gather around certain figures in history, creating a gentle fog of myth that is neither entirely true nor entirely false. They're not chrononauts in any literal sense, not travellers stepping through a machine, but they possess a kind of temporal looseness, an ability to reach across what seems like a solid boundary between now and later. Sometimes the explanation is simple brilliance, other times it feels like inspiration arriving from a place just beyond reach. There are also quieter figures, names that aren't painted across textbooks but linger at the edges of history, people whose unusual knowledge leaves a faint ripple behind them. A mathematician who wrote about ideas centuries before the language of modern mathematics emerged. A monk who recorded astronomical events with startling precision, using no known tools capable of such accuracy. A craftsperson whose techniques resemble those rediscovered only by modern engineering. These people often lived modest lives, unnoticed by their societies, yet somehow left traces that shimmer faintly when we look back. Human memory plays its own part in these stories. When we encounter someone unusual from the past, we sometimes project our own hopes and patterns onto their lives. We want to believe that history contains little gaps where something extraordinary slipped through. But even when we adjust for exaggeration, there remain individuals whose lives continue to feel a little out of place, like notes in a melody that don't quite fit but somehow make the song more beautiful. This sense of being timeless can appear in many forms. Sometimes it's a person whose understanding of nature feels centuries ahead. Sometimes it's a scientist whose intuition leaps across gaps others haven't even noticed. Sometimes it's a writer whose descriptions of future social structures read like quiet predictions. And sometimes it's simply someone whose work seems to echo a future discovery with uncanny closeness, as if they glanced at a page of history that had not yet been written. Imagine walking through a narrow cobblestone street in an old European town. The buildings are low and worn. The smell of dust and old wood lingers in the air. In a small workshop lit by the warm glow of a candle, a young apprentice might be carving something, an object whose shape is unfamiliar, whose purpose won't be understood for centuries. They are not a time traveller. They are simply curious, patient, and attentive to the patterns that nature reveals in whispered fragments. That object may disappear for a long time, reappearing centuries later in a textbook or a laboratory where it is finally recognised for what it is. And when someone discovers the original artifact, they might feel that same strange impulse, the feeling that it shouldn't belong where it was found. This is how time often behaves, not in clean lines, but in waves that overlap and recede. People sense ideas before they take form. Artists dream shapes long before tools exist to build them. Scientists sketch theories that won't be tested until centuries later. Sometimes it's nothing more than creativity reaching beyond its immediate horizon. Sometimes it's coincidence, but sometimes in a quiet and unassuming way, it feels like a soft echo, one that suggests the future might not be entirely silent. Whether these individuals were touched by some whisper from a distant era, or simply carried extraordinary imagination, their presence in the historical record invites us to pause and reflect. They remind us that time is not always as rigid as we imagine, and that human intuition often exceeds the boundaries we set around it. Perhaps that is why these stories persist. not because they prove time travel, but because they invite us to look at history not as a rigid sequence, but as a living tapestry where some threads glimmer ahead of their time. As we drift onward, these unusual figures become companions in our exploration, guides who hint that time might have corners we haven't yet learned to see, places where inspiration and possibility flow in directions we don't fully understand. There is a gentle kind of magic in imagining time not as a single straight path, but as a fabric, a woven sheet that stretches, folds and relaxes with the quiet movements of the universe. When you picture it this way, the idea of chronological contamination becomes less about dramatic interference and more about the soft possibility that different moments might occasionally brush against one another. Not enough to break history, not enough to leave anything jarring behind, but perhaps just enough for a hint of something to slip through, the way the faint scent of rain can drift into a room before a storm has even arrived. This idea begins from a simple observation. In nature, boundaries are rarely perfect. Light leaks through curtains, warmth escapes from a cup of tea, and memories blend together in ways that blur their edges. If time has its own texture, and many physicists believe it does, then perhaps its boundaries also behave this way. Not perfectly sealed, but porous in small, delicate ways. And in those microscopic spaces between moments, something subtle might pass from one era to another. Imagine two moments in time lying close together like sheets drying on a clothesline. A gentle breeze moves them ever so slightly, and for a brief instant their edges touch. If time were capable of similar tiny contacts, then the influence that passes through would be soft, quiet, and almost unnoticeable. A thought, perhaps. A small idea. A brief intuition that arrives without a clear source. Or an object crafted slightly ahead of its age, as though someone sensed a design that belonged to a time yet to come. This is not the kind of influence that creates paradoxes or dramatic ripples. It is not a traveller stepping boldly into history or a machine blazing with light. Instead, it feels more like a whisper, something that barely leaves a trace but still changes the moment ever so slightly. We might even experience it without realising, the way we sometimes pick up a melody from a passing conversation and carry it for the rest of the day. One way to think about these soft influences is through the metaphor of a lake. When two small waves approach each other from different directions, they can overlap without colliding violently. For a moment, the water rises just a bit higher, the shape of each wave blending gently with the other. Then they separate and continue on, unchanged at their core. If echoes from the future were to reach the present, they might arrive in a similar way. Brief, overlapping ripples that add something subtle before fading again. Some researchers have suggested that certain kinds of knowledge might appear in this way. A technique rediscovered centuries after its first creation. A fragment of understanding that jumps ahead without a clear lineage. A sudden spark of innovation that seems to come from nowhere. These are not proof of time travel, of course, and they fit comfortably within the bounds of human creativity. But the poetic version of the story, the one we're exploring tonight, allows us to consider whether these sparks could sometimes be temporal coincidences, small signs of moments brushing lightly against each other. We see hints of this in the natural world as well. Migratory birds adjust their routes in ways we still don't fully understand, as if they sense patterns in the environment long before they arrive. Certain species bloom earlier or later based on subtle changes that ripple through ecosystems. These phenomena are not related to time travel, yet they show how delicate signals can influence behaviour in quiet, almost invisible ways. If nature itself responds to faint cues, then imagining time as another kind of environment, with its own soft currents, is not so far-fetched. The human mind, too, is a place where moments can overlap. Memories surface unexpectedly. Dream images mix with real sensations, and intuition sometimes guides decisions before conscious thought catches up. Neuroscientists describe these processes through networks and patterns. but anyone who has ever felt a sudden, unexplainable certainty knows how mysterious the mind can be. In that mystery, some people find a doorway to the idea that perhaps the mind can pick up faint echoes from beyond the present moment. Chronological contamination, in its gentlest interpretation, does not claim that the future reaches back to alter history. Instead, it offers the possibility that time may allow tiny exchanges, nothing strong enough to disrupt events, but just enough to create small anomalies, a thought out of place, a design ahead of its age, a story that feels older or newer than it should, a coincidence that fits too neatly to ignore, yet too softly to claim as evidence. Imagine an inventor in a quiet workshop centuries ago. Their hands move without hesitation, guided by a sense of shape and function they cannot explain. They create something unusual, perhaps something that does not entirely belong to their time. They do not think of themselves as innovators or visionaries. They simply follow a gentle pull from somewhere they cannot name. Later, historians look at the object and note that it seems out of place, a little too advanced, almost suspiciously prescient. But perhaps the inventor was simply standing in a moment where two threads of time brushed briefly together. Or picture a writer who dreams of a strange machine, a system, or an idea decades before engineers will build anything like it. The dream feels vivid and vivid enough that they write about it, not knowing why. When future generations read their words, the descriptions echo modern technology closely enough to raise eyebrows. Yet the writer was working not from foresight, but from a quiet impression, like catching a faint reflection of something not yet fully formed. In these stories there is no paradox, no conflict, and no breaking of natural laws. There is only the gentle suggestion that time might have corners where moments come close enough to share hints with one another. These hints do not change history, they simply enrich its texture, adding depth and mystery to the way ideas travel across generations. As we continue exploring the possibility of temporal echoes, these soft influences remind us that time may be more flexible than we imagine, not in dramatic ways, but in delicate ones, ways that allow creativity, intuition, and the occasional anomaly to drift in directions that don't always follow a straight chronological path. And perhaps, in those drifting currents, we catch a glimpse of how the future might occasionally leave a quiet impression on the present, like the faint outline of a footprint left before the traveller arrives. There is a comforting simplicity in imagining time as a long, familiar road, a path stretching from the past behind us to the future ahead. We picture ourselves walking along it step by gentle step, unable to turn around, unable to search anything behind us except through memory. Yet when scientists began studying gravity and the shape of space-time, they discovered that this road might not be as straight as it feels. Under certain conditions that stretch the imagination more than the laws of nature, time can bend, and when it bends far enough, it can begin to curve back toward itself. The idea sounds dramatic, but its essence can be understood in a quiet, almost comforting way. Imagine taking a walk through a garden early in the morning. The path winds softly through trees and tall grass, curving gently until, without realizing it, you return to the place where you started. There was no sudden turn, no abrupt shift, only a slow, natural arc. In the mathematics of space-time, something similar can occur. A path that a beam of light or a traveller might follow could, in theory, curve so gracefully that it eventually returns to the very moment it left. This kind of path is often called a closed time loop, though tonight we can think of it simply as a circle drawn in the fabric of time. The physics behind this circle is usually described with long equations, but its soul is peaceful. It is the recognition that time is not a rigid ruler. It is more like a landscape that can bend, stretch, twist and fold in ways that are invisible to us. Just as a sheet of paper can be curled so that 2 points meet, space-time can curl as well. on a grand, enough scale, near certain types of massive rotating objects or along specific cosmic structures, the bending might become so strong that the forward direction eventually merges with what we would call backward. Not because the universe is contradicting itself, but because it is exploring a shape more intricate than the straight lines we usually imagine. Think of it like a river that loops into an oxbow bend. The water continues to flow forward, but if you drift long enough inside the bend, you may find yourself near places the river passed earlier. You haven't reversed direction, you've simply travelled along a curved path. A closed loop in time is similar. A traveller moving forward at every moment might still return to an earlier point on their timeline, not by defying physics, but by following the natural curvature of a rare, unusual structure in space-time. This idea, as beautiful as it is, carries a whisper of mystery. If a moment can be revisited, does that moment remain exactly the same? Can an event occur twice? Or is the loop self-consistent, repeating in a seamless cycle like a melody played over and over again? These questions lead to paradoxes, the famous puzzles where logic seems to knot itself into twists. But when we focus not on the paradoxes but on the imagery, the idea becomes softer, a moment returning to itself, not to change anything, but to complete a circle. In nature, circles are everywhere. The orbits of planets, the cycles of seasons, the turning of day into night and back again. Even the patterns in our own lives often loop. Memories resurfacing, old habits returning, familiar emotions rising and falling. It makes sense then that if time can shape itself freely, it might choose curves and circles rather than insisting on a perfect line. Theoretical physicists sometimes use the analogy of a traveller following a time-like path, a path shaped by the natural flow of time rather than by space. If that path bends enough, it becomes a loop. We can translate that into softer terms. Imagine walking toward the future so steadily and so naturally that you don't realise you're approaching a place you've been before. There is no machinery required, no portal glowing with light, only the landscape of the universe guiding the journey in a gentle circle. Some solutions in physics hint at places where this might happen, universes that rotate ever so slowly as though the entire cosmos were turning like a great wheel. Massive objects whose spin drags space-time around them, curling it into tight spirals. Hypothetical structures shaped like infinitely long threads, stretching across the universe, capable of twisting time as they move. These ideas are often described in terms that sound intimidating, but at their heart they are stories about how the universe's shape can create paths full of possibility. When we listen to these stories at a soft human pace, we begin to realise that a closed time loop is not a violent or chaotic idea. It is instead a gentle one. A loop implies harmony, repetition, and continuity. It suggests that the universe may have places where time folds like fabric, where the beginning and the end of a moment come close enough to touch. If someone were to imagine temporal echoes, faint impressions drifting from the future to the present, closed loops provide a poetic backdrop. Not a firm explanation, not a mechanism, but a tone, a feeling. If time can form circles, then perhaps echoes travel along those curves, reaching earlier points the way a voice might carry across a canyon and return from a different direction. Of course, no one has walked such a loop. No spacecraft has followed a curved path through time and returned to an earlier moment. These ideas remain possibilities, beautiful, distant possibilities that belong more to thought experiments than to our daily experience. Yet the concept invites us to imagine time as something alive, capable of shapes that surprise us. And when you imagine that, the world becomes a little more mysterious, a little more layered, a little more capable of moments that shimmer with the suggestion that something has drifted close from another point along the curve. So, as we drift deeper into the exploration of temporal echoes, the idea of closed loop serves as a quiet foundation, a reminder that time may not be the strict forward march we assume. It might be capable of forming paths that return gently to themselves, carrying soft remnants of distant moments along with them. When people first hear the word wormhole, the mind often jumps to images of swirling tunnels and glowing entrances carved into the fabric of the universe. But the truth, when told softly and without the hard edges of equations, is much gentler. A wormhole is simply a way of imagining that two distant places, two regions of space, or even two moments in time, might be closer than they appear, like two pages of a book that rest far apart in the story, yet lie directly beside each other when the book is closed. If you think of space-time as a vast sheet stretched wide and smooth, then the idea of a wormhole begins with a simple gesture, folding that sheet. When the edges come near, even though the surface itself is large, distant points suddenly sit side by side, and if a small opening could appear in those touching points, like a tiny doorway between two windows, then a traveller might step through one and find themselves emerging from the other, skipping the long road in between. This image of two windows touching in a dream is perhaps the most peaceful way to picture a wormhole. Imagine lying in a quiet room at night, the curtains drawn, the air still. You drift into a dream where two houses stand on opposite sides of a hill. In one house you see a window glowing softly. In the other house, far away, there is another window, identical in shape. But in the dream they begin to drift toward one another, the edges of the windows aligning until they meet perfectly, like two leaves carried by a gentle breeze. When they touch, the boundary dissolves, and suddenly you can step from one house to the other without crossing the hill at all. This is the spirit of a wormhole, a shortcut, a joining, a quiet connection. Nothing violent or abrupt, just an unexpected closeness between places that should be far apart. In some versions of this idea, the two windows are not merely separated in space, but also in time. One window might open onto a moment slightly ahead or slightly behind. Time, after all, flows differently depending on gravity, motion, and the deep curvature of space-time. A clock near a massive object ticks more slowly. A clock travelling quickly experiences fewer seconds. These are not exotic or speculative effects. They're measured every day, even in the ordinary functioning of satellites orbiting the Earth. When people imagine wormholes, they sometimes extend this idea gently. If two openings experience time differently, stepping through might feel like stepping into another moment. Of course, wormholes, if they exist, would not behave like tunnels carved through hard stone. They would be delicate, more like soap bubbles shimmering between realities. Left alone, such a bubble might collapse instantly, its opening shrinking to nothing before anything could pass through. To keep one open, the surrounding structure needs to resist the inward pull of gravity, like a tent that must be held upright by poles and tension. The material that keeps the opening from collapsing is often described in technical language, but for our purposes, it can be imagined as something that creates negative pressure, something that pushes outward when everything else pushes inward. Think of it as a tent in a windy field. The canvas wants to fall inward, but a set of strong poles keeps it stretched open. If the poles were to vanish, the tent would deflate immediately. In the same way, a wormhole would need a kind of support to stay open, a force or substance that gently holds the tunnel apart. Whether such a thing exists in the real universe is still a mystery, but as a piece of imaginative physics, it offers a peaceful way to picture an extraordinary possibility, and even if the universe permits such tunnels in principle, it might guard them carefully. Nature has a tendency to prevent the most disruptive forms of time manipulation. Sudden, dramatic jumps backward or forward could create paradoxes, and the universe seems to prefer consistency over chaos. If wormholes ever form, they may exist like hidden forest paths, shaded, fragile, and vanishing at the slightest disturbance. Not meant for grand voyages, but for the faint exchange of something much smaller, something softer, perhaps a ripple of information, perhaps the ghost of a possibility. It can be comforting to imagine that if wormholes ever flicker into existence, they might not, behave like roaring portals. They might appear like fleeting moments between thoughts, an intuition arriving too quickly, a déjà vu that feels strangely vivid, a sense that the future brushed close enough to whisper. Not a traveller stepping through, but an impression carried lightly across a narrow seam in space-time. And because these tunnels, if real, would be so delicate, it makes sense that we have never seen one. They may exist only for the briefest fractions of moments, far shorter than a heartbeat, far briefer than a flicker of light. They might rise and collapse in silence, unnoticed by any instrument we have built. Or they might never form at all, serving simply as a reminder that reality allows more shapes than the straight lines we expect. When we picture wormholes this way, not as machines or portals, but as quiet connections, the concept becomes far less intimidating. It becomes another possibility in the broad tapestry of time, a soft suggestion that the universe might contain bridges we're not yet able to cross. Bridges where time and space touch lightly before drifting apart again. As we drift further into the landscape of temporal echoes, wormholes serve not as proof or prediction, but as gentle storytellers. They remind us that the universe has corners and folds, and that some of those folds might allow one moment to lean close to another. Whether anything ever travels through these folds is a question that remains unanswered, but the image of two distant windows touching for a heartbeat adds a quiet beauty to our exploration of time. There is a certain calm reassurance that comes from knowing the universe has boundaries, soft ones perhaps, but boundaries nonetheless. Just as the ocean has tides and the sky has seasons, time, too, may have its quiet rules. And one of the gentlest yet most profound ideas about those rules comes from a thought Stephen Hawking shared with the scientific world, the notion that the universe protects its own timeline, not through force or alarms, but through subtle mechanisms woven into the fabric of reality itself. To understand this idea in a peaceful, bedtime-friendly way, imagine time as a long thread stretched across a loom. For the most part, the thread lies smooth and taut. It carries the patterns of our lives, our memories, and the sequence of events that unfold one after another. But every now and then, a curious hand might tug at the thread, perhaps pulling too sharply, perhaps twisting it in a way that threatens to create a knot. In Hawking's picture of the universe, when such a twist becomes too extreme, the thread does something simple and elegant. It snaps back into place before anything tangled can form. This gentle snap-back is what Hawking called the universe's chronology protection principle. It is the idea that whenever a physical situation threatens to create a closed loop in time, a loop that might allow someone to step back into a moment already past, the underlying rules of the cosmos quietly intervene. Not dramatically, not with explosions or ruptures, but with a kind of cosmic tightening, as though the fabric of space-time decides that such a loop would be one fold too many. In more technical language, physicists talk about unstable conditions near these would-be time loops. Energy begins to rise sharply, like pressure building inside a delicate bubble. But instead of speaking about that pressure in terms of equations, we can imagine it as a gentle warning. The universe humming to itself, vibrating a little too strongly, reminding any potential traveller that the doorway they are approaching is not meant to stay open. Even though the math behind this idea is complex, its emotional tone is surprisingly comforting. It suggests that reality has a kind of inner coherence, a preference for order over contradiction. Just as nature resists sudden temperature spikes or impossible chemical combinations, it also resists scenes where a traveller could meet their younger self or alter moments that have already flowed into the river of the past. The universe, like a careful gardener, trims away the branches that would twist too wildly. This doesn't mean time is rigid or uninteresting. On the contrary, the universe still allows the strange behaviour of clocks near massive objects, still lets particles behave in ways that challenge intuition, and still scatters hints that time is not a simple, one-directional march. But when a loop threatens to form in a way that could disrupt the harmony of cause and effect, the universe seems to whisper a gentle but firm no. And yet this cosmic restraint doesn't erase the dreamlike possibility of softer anomalies, those faint echoes we've been exploring. If anything, it clarifies their nature. The universe may close the door on the loud forms of time travel, the kind that would rewrite history or collide with logic, but it leaves room for the quiet forms. Like reflections on water, soft ripples of possibility can drift across the surface without violating any deep rule. A traveller cannot march boldly into the past, but a whisper of influence, a gentle echo, a fleeting impression, that is different. That is subtle. That is the kind of thing the universe might permit, because it doesn't threaten the structure of the thread. To make this idea more relatable, imagine a library late at night. The shelves stand tall and still. Each book represents a moment in time, events arranged in a sequence that must not be disturbed. If someone tried to take a book from the middle and place it at the beginning, the order would collapse, the story would lose its coherence. But perhaps a breeze from an open window could flip a page, or the soft creaking of the building could shift a volume forward by an inch. These changes don't break the story. They don't ruin the timeline. They are simply small murmurs in the quiet of the library, hints of movement that reflect the building's natural settling. Hawking's idea plays a similar role in the universe. It keeps the books in order, but doesn't forbid the small movements, the whispers, the gentle page-turning that might resemble echoes across time. The loud interventions are prevented. The soft ones remain possible. Some physicists imagine the universe as a kind of self-stabilizing system. When a dangerous configuration forms, something that could lead to a paradox, the underlying laws generate effects that rise sharply, like a warning light becoming brighter. These effects would destabilize any time door before it fully forms. But if the potential influence is tiny, fleeting, and harmless, like a memory that doesn't belong, or a coincidence that seems too perfect, the universe has no need to intervene. Such faint signals don't threaten the story. This idea invites a gentle reflection. Perhaps the future does not shout at the past, but it might be able to murmur. Maybe the boldest kinds of time travel are impossible, because they would tear at the fabric of cause and effect. But the soft kinds, the ones that feel like intuition, or inspiration, or a dream that arrives too early, might fall within the universe's quiet allowances. As we drift further into our exploration of temporal echoes, Hawking's chronology protection stands as a kind of cosmic guardian. Not a forbidding one, but a gentle overseer ensuring that the story of the universe remains readable, coherent and whole. And within that coherence, within those careful constraints, there is still space for mystery, for gentle folds of time, and for echoes that touch us without breaking anything at all. There is a special kind of story that appears now and then in conversations about time, a story that feels almost like a parable whispered beside a campfire. It begins with someone trying to change the past, perhaps to stop an accident, prevent a mistake, or alter an event that shaped their life in a painful way. They step into the moment with determination, imagining themselves as the one who will rewrite the story. But as they act, something unexpected happens. Every attempt they make ends up contributing to the very event they wish to prevent. The harder they try to push the past into a different shape, the more firmly they become part of the shape that already exists. This gentle loop, where cause and effect blend into one continuous curve, captures the essence of the idea we call self-consistency. In its softest and most human form, it suggests that certain events in time may be less like open choices and more like melodies returning to their original notes, humming along a pattern that resists being altered. Rather than allowing contradictions, moments where an event both happens and does not happen, the universe may guide all actions, even unexpected ones, into a single, seamless flow. Imagine standing on a hillside watching a flock of birds turn in the sky. Their movement seems chaotic at first. wings beating in every direction. But then you notice the underlying harmony, a curved motion, a collective turn, a subtle coordination. You might see one bird shift course as if deciding to break away, only to discover that its path leads it naturally back into the pattern. The flock wasn't controlling it. The shape of the movement simply guided everything back into coherence. In the imagery of time, the Novikov principle works much the same way. It suggests that if time ever allows loops, places where a traveller might return to a moment already lived, those loops would always settle into patterns that make sense, avoiding contradictions the way rivers avoid flowing uphill. You might try to push against the current, but the landscape gently channels your steps. Even a dramatic choice may ultimately become part of the very history you believed you were rewriting. One of the most poetic examples of this idea is the notion of the originless object. In more technical discussions, this is called a bootstrap paradox, but in a softer, bedtime sense, it's like finding a note on your desk in your own handwriting, offering a clue you desperately need. You follow the clue, and years later, you realise you are the one who wrote it, but only because you saw it on your desk long ago. The note has no true beginning. It is a circle, a loop, a whisper from a moment that gave birth to itself. There is something strangely comforting about this, like listening to a song with no start or end, only a continuous melody. These loops remind us that not everything needs a first cause. Some things may simply belong to the structure of time itself, arising because the universe permits the shape. And if these loops exist, they do not break anything. They do not disrupt free will or force us into rigid paths. Instead, they create a sense of coherence, as though time is gently maintaining a story that holds together no matter how many twists and turns it contains. To picture this more intuitively, imagine a person returning to the past to stop a lantern from falling in a busy marketplace. They run toward the lantern, reaching out to catch it before it shatters. But as they push through the crowd, they bump into someone carrying a stack of baskets. The baskets fall, startling a child, whose sudden motion knocks the lantern from its hook. In trying to prevent the fall, the traveller has become part of the cause. They haven't failed. They have simply fulfilled the role that the story already held for them. Time holds its shape, not by restricting action, but by guiding every choice, large or small, into a path that remains whole. This idea, far from creating a sense of imprisonment, paints time as a gentle canvas where every brushstroke finds a place. Free will still exists, every decision is still made freely. But the outcomes, especially in the rare circumstances where loops might appear, settle naturally into patterns that are consistent with what has already unfolded. In other words, you may choose your steps, but the ground beneath those steps leads you back onto a path that avoids breaking the harmony of the timeline. When we think about temporal echoes, the faint impressions drifting from one moment to another, self-consistency offers a soothing framework. If echoes from the future do reach the present, they do so in ways that maintain the integrity of the story. A whisper of insight might arrive before its time, but only if that whisper fits seamlessly into the world. An idea might appear in an ancient artisan's hands, not because the future forced itself backward, but because the shape of time allowed the idea to exist in both places without contradiction. Many of the world's most puzzling historical anomalies, objects centuries ahead of their era, stories that predict events long before they happen, scientific intuitions that seem to arrive out of thin air, might be seen through this gentle lens. They do not need to be proof of time travellers or cosmic intervention. They could simply be the subtle products of a universe that prefers coherent loops over fractured ones. A suggestion that some ideas, some moments, are naturally circular. As we drift further on this journey, the concept of self-consistency becomes a bridge between the physical possibilities of time and the mysteries of human experience. It tells us that if time ever does fold in on itself, the folds will be smooth, the loops will be gentle, and the echoes, if they exist, will always arrive in ways that keep the story intact. like the soft return of a melody you've heard before, appearing with perfect timing just when the song needs it. There is a moment each night, just as you begin to drift away from wakefulness, when the world loosens its edges. Thoughts lose their hard outlines, sounds soften, and memories begin to mingle with imagination in gentle, drifting patterns. In that space between waking and sleeping, the mind slips into a realm where time seems less strict. A dream can pull you into a memory, or send you into a place that has never existed, or offer a scene so vivid that when you wake, it lingers like the scent of something familiar yet unnamed. And sometimes, just sometimes, a dream feels like a visitor from somewhere ahead. Many people carry stories of dreams that seem to arrive early, a conversation that later happens word for word, a person they had never met appearing with a face that later becomes real, a symbol, an event, or a quiet warning that makes sense only in hindsight. These stories drift through cultures, families, and generations. They appear in old journals and whispered legends. And though science approaches such tales with caution, the human experience behind them has a soft, undeniable presence. In the language of folklore, such dreams are seen as messages from another realm, windows, where the future sends gentle ripples into the present. In the language of neuroscience, dreams are patterns of memory and intuition reshuffling themselves, forming connections that the waking mind would not normally consider. And somewhere between these two explanations lies a place where the emotional truth of prophetic dreams lives, a space where the mind becomes unusually sensitive, able to listen in ways that waking thought often cannot. To understand why dreams sometimes feel like they come from tomorrow, it helps to think about how the mind forms predictions. Every day, your brain gathers small details, tones of voice, patterns of behaviour, shifts in the environment, half-noticed clues. Most of these details never rise to the surface of awareness. But at night, when the mind drifts free from logical structure, those details weave together into new shapes. A dream might bring forward something you hadn't consciously seen, creating the illusion of foresight when the truth is simply that your mind was paying attention all along. Yet there are dreams that resist this explanation. Stories of people dreaming about events far removed from their daily lives. A distant disaster. The sudden appearance of someone they had never met. A solution to a problem they hadn't begun to consider consciously. These experiences feel uncanny because they do not fit neatly into the usual patterns of memory. They feel like whispers that arrive too early, carrying impressions from a moment not yet lived. If one wished to imagine temporal echoes, dreams provide the softest canvas on which such echoes might appear. Dreams are already unanchored from linear time. They jump from childhood to distant futures, blending places and moments with no regard for physics or chronology. In that free-flowing space, if there were any faint signals drifting across the folds of time, faint enough not to break the rules of the universe, dreams would be the most natural place for them to land. To picture this, imagine lying in a dark room as a thin breeze moves through the window. The curtains shift, barely perceptible. The air changes shape around you. Now imagine that time too has breezes, subtle movements, soft overlaps, quiet minglings of possibility. A dream might be like that curtain, sensitive enough to catch even the faintest of those movements, translating them into images and stories. Neuroscientists who study sleep describe dreams as the brain's rehearsal hall, a place where it runs simulations, resolves tensions, and explores emotional landscapes. But even within that scientific framework, there is room for mystery. Why do some dreams feel deeper than simulation? More like messages, more like reflections of something we have not yet encountered. Why do certain dreams lodge themselves in memory, as if they're waiting for the moment when reality catches up? One explanation is emotional resonance. A dream that mirrors a future event does not need to, contain perfect detail. It might simply hold the emotional tone, the feeling of something about to happen. When that event later unfolds, the dream feels eerily prophetic, not because it predicted the event, but because it captured the emotional climate surrounding it. Another explanation is pattern recognition. Humans have a remarkable ability to detect patterns long before they consciously understand them. A dream may simply reveal a pattern your mind has quietly pieced together during the day. You wake with the impression of prophecy, when really the dream is your mind's quiet way of saying, "You knew this all along." But there remains a third possibility, one that sits gently at the edge of imagination. It is neither scientific nor supernatural, but simply poetic. The idea that the mind, when freed from the structure of waking thought, might tune itself to something broader than the present moment. Not a message from the future, not a warning, not an intrusion, just an echo, a hint, a breeze from a moment ahead that brushes the mind lightly before drifting away. This interpretation doesn't claim that dreams foretell the future. It simply allows for the possibility that time, with all its folds and layers, might sometimes permit small impressions to travel softly between moments without breaking any cosmic rule. If the universe protects its timeline from loud disruptions, as we've seen before, it might still allow the quietest of whispers to pass through. Whispers subtle enough not to alter anything, yet strong enough for the dreaming mind to notice. When people share stories of prophetic dreams, they almost always describe the same feeling. Not fear, but familiarity. As though something had already been lived long before it occurred. As though the dream was not an announcement, but a memory leaning forward from a moment yet to come. Whether these dreams arise from intuition, pattern recognition, emotional alignment, or something more mysterious, they remind us that the boundaries between past, present, and future are not always sharp. They blur, shimmer, and merge in the soft landscape of sleep. And perhaps in that shimmering, a person might glimpse a piece of tomorrow, not through certainty, but through the gentle touch of possibility. There's a moment, often late in the evening when the world has quieted down, when the mind begins noticing connections it may have ignored during the day. A message arrives just as you were thinking about someone. A streetlight flickers at the exact second a memory crosses your mind. A melody plays on the radio that matches a dream you barely remembered. These small coincidences drift through life like fireflies, brief, glowing, and strangely captivating. And although logic insists they're random, the heart sometimes wonders whether they might be something more. Humans are natural pattern seekers. Our ancestors survived by detecting shapes in tall grass, reading moods in the movements of animals, and predicting storms by watching the colour of the sky. That instinct hasn't left us. Even now, our minds lean forward, trying to find meaning in the noise of everyday life. When a coincidence aligns too perfectly, it might feel as though the universe has paused for a second to whisper something. Not loudly, just a soft trace of intention hidden inside randomness. To understand how these experiences fit into the idea of temporal echoes, it helps to picture randomness not as a void of meaning but as a sea of possibilities. Imagine standing at the edge of the ocean at dusk. The waves look chaotic, rising and falling without a pattern you can predict. But if you look more carefully, you begin to notice rhythms, swells forming in the distance, currents tugging in gentle directions, quiet pulses beneath the surface. On the surface, everything seems scattered. Deeper down, something is guiding the movement. Our lives can be like that sea. Moments roll in and roll out, some large, some small, some utterly forgettable. Yet occasionally, two waves arrive together in perfect harmony, as though carried by an unseen tide. A person thinking of a childhood friend happens to receive a message from them moments later. A painter dreams of a pattern they've never seen, and then stumbles upon it in nature the next day. A scientist wakes with the solution to a problem that had eluded them for months, though nothing new happened the day before. These alignments feel like signals, even when we tell ourselves they're chance. Statisticians reassure us that coincidences are inevitable in a world filled with billions of lives, trillions of interactions, and countless tiny variables. But even they admit that while randomness explains the frequency, it doesn't fully capture the feeling, the sense that a moment has leaned slightly out of alignment with the ordinary flow of time. And it is in that feeling, that delicate hesitation between meaning and chance, where the idea of temporal echoes finds its foothold. Some people describe the sensation as though something reaches back, nudging thoughts or events into place just a bit earlier than expected. Not enough to change anything significant, not enough to disturb the structure of the world, just a soft adjustment, like brushing a stray leaf back onto a path. If time truly has folds and layers, as we've imagined, then perhaps small ripples from a future moment could drift backward, shaping the arrangement of coincidences the way a stone thrown into a pond sends waves outward in both directions. Of course, from a scientific perspective, randomness is still randomness, yet certain experiments in physics have revealed that even random processes can have hidden structure, tiny fluctuations in light, particles choosing one path instead of another, quantum events that seem entirely unpredictable. All these behave in ways that hint at patterns arising from deeper rules. Nothing mystical or supernatural, just the quiet complexity of nature. If the smallest building blocks of reality can hide subtle structure beneath apparent chaos, then perhaps the coincidences in our lives can too. This brings us to the poetic idea of temporal signatures. Not signatures in the literal sense, no symbols carved into time, no messages whispering from the future, but rather subtle imprints, patterns that stand out in the sea of randomness. Imagine them like faint footprints on a snowy path. Most of the snow is untouched, pure and even, but here and there a single mark disrupts the surface in a way that looks intentional, even though it could easily have formed through chance. Temporal signatures could be the emotional weight behind certain coincidences, the way a moment resonates, the way it feels oddly placed or strangely meaningful. It's not that these experiences prove anything about time travel or future influence. The universe gives no loud confirmations. Instead, these moments offer a gentle invitation to look closer, to notice the shapes formed by the waves as they pass. Consider, for example, someone who wakes suddenly in the night with the thought of an old memory they haven't recalled in years. The next morning, they find an object connected to that memory, hidden behind a drawer or tucked into a book. Nothing supernatural has occurred. The object was always there, but the timing feels uncanny, as if a quiet thread linked the two moments, the memory drifting ahead of its discovery, the discovery drifting back toward the memory. Or think of the way two strangers' lives sometimes converge at exactly the right moment, a moment that leads to kindness, rescue, connection, or transformation. Statistically, it's just alignment. Emotionally, it feels like a pattern emerging from chaos, a thread drawn taut across time. These experiences do not require us to believe in destiny or fate. They simply suggest that randomness has texture, and sometimes that texture brushes against us in ways that feel meaningful. And because our minds are sensitive instruments, especially when we are tired, quiet, or open to reflection, we notice these touches the way we notice a soft draft in a still room. As we continue exploring the idea of temporal echoes, it's helpful to think of coincidences as possible windows rather than proof. They do not confirm anything about the future reaching back, but they also do not rule out the poetic possibility that the universe allows gentle alignments to form, ripples that pass through the folds of time without disturbing its integrity. Perhaps randomness is simply the part of the story we haven't fully learned to read yet, and in its shifting shapes, we may glimpse hints, not messages, not warnings, just impressions, of how moments relate to one another across the subtle fabric of time. There is something quietly fascinating about the way our digital world records nearly everything we do. Every search, every message, every comment, every passing thought typed into a glowing screen becomes part of a vast, drifting sea of information. And because the internet remembers so much, some scientists once wondered whether it might remember something impossible, a trace of tomorrow left behind today. Not a dramatic message, not a clear prediction, but a small, subtle clue that someone out there might be travelling through time, or at the very least brushing against it in ways the rest of us don't notice. This idea formed the foundation of a gentle yet unusual scientific study, carried out by two researchers, Robert Nemiroff and Teresa Wilson. Instead of building machines or peering into telescopes, they turned their attention to a quieter, surprisingly poetic question. If time travellers exist, and if they ever wandered through our digital age, would their presence leave behind tiny ripples in the ocean of online data? Imagine standing on a beach at dawn watching the tide pull back. Most of what you see is water, smooth and rhythmic, but now and then a small shell or piece of driftwood appears at your feet, evidence of something that passed long before you arrived. The researchers wondered if the internet might contain similar pieces of driftwood, words typed too early, references made before their time, or faint fingerprints of someone who knew what was coming. Their approach was simple, almost elegant in its restraint. They chose a handful of events that were entirely unpredictable before they happened, moments that could not have been guessed or anticipated without access to future knowledge. These included the name of a newly appointed public figure, a comet discovered unexpectedly, and a rare, newsworthy event. Then they searched, not for signs of machines or footprints or grand proclamations, but for the smallest hint that someone had typed these names or events before the world knew they existed. In a way, this search was a modern echo of ancient divination, except instead of gazing into clouds or the patterns of birds, the researchers gazed into search bars, forum threads, and archived posts. Quiet places where people leave trails without thinking. And just like an archaeologist brushes dust from an old pot, they brushed through layers of digital history looking for anything out of place. If someone from the future had been careless, even slightly, they might have left behind a premature mention, a casual slip of knowledge, a timestamp that didn't quite make sense. It would not have to be dramatic. A single tweet, a half-forgotten blog post, a comment wondering aloud about something that would only become relevant years later, a detail that didn't fit. But in the end, after all the searching, the digital shore was quiet. There were no shells from tomorrow, no driftwood washed in from the future. The researchers found nothing that suggested someone had stepped backward through time and left a message for us to find. The silence wasn't disappointing, it was strangely peaceful. The world, it seemed, was consistent with the timeline we knew. Yet even this quiet result opens doors to contemplation. Silence can mean many things. Perhaps there truly are no chrononauts, no travellers from future civilizations wandering through our era. Or perhaps time, as we explored in earlier sessions, tightly guards itself against actions that would make such traces possible. If the universe resists paradoxes, as Hawking once suggested, then maybe any traveller would be unable to reveal themselves, not by rule or punishment, but simply because the structure of time would not permit it. Another possibility is more poetic. If anyone ever did travel backward through time, perhaps they would have their own reasons for remaining hidden. Not out of fear, but out of a quiet respect for the fragile, unfolding story of the world. If you were a visitor to a past decade, would you announce yourself boldly, or would you move gently through the era, trying not to disturb the delicate patterns of a time not your own? There is also the practical side. A civilization advanced enough to explore time would almost certainly be advanced enough to navigate the subtleties of leaving no trace behind. A traveller from a distant century would understand that even the smallest change, one premature word, one misplaced comment might ripple outward. They would be careful, cautious, perhaps even reverent, moving through the past as though it were a library filled with fragile manuscripts that could crumble at a careless touch. And finally, of course, there is a quieter interpretation. Perhaps the future exists in ways we cannot yet imagine, and whatever relationship it has with our present moment happens far beneath the threshold of detection. If temporal echoes truly drift between moments, they might be too faint to leave fingerprints on digital archives. They might exist only in intuition, coincidence, and dream, a theme we explored earlier and one we will continue to build upon. In this light, the Nemiroff experiment becomes less about proving or disproving time travel and more about asking a tender question. If the future ever touched the present, where might we see the signs? The internet was chosen because it's full of tiny details, millions of movements, thoughts and interactions happening at every instant. If even there we find no unmistakable trace, then the echoes we search for must be softer, quieter, more delicate than any timestamp could capture. And so the researchers concluded their study. No proclamations, no sensational headlines, only a gentle, thoughtful silence. A reminder that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that the mysteries of time may operate in ways that do not leave trails for us to follow. As we move into deeper explorations of technology and modern anomalies, this quiet investigation remains an anchor, an elegant gesture toward the convergence of curiosity, science, and imagination, reassuring us that even in silence, new questions can arise, waiting patiently in the folds of time. In the quiet hours of the evening, when screens dim and the world settles into a slower rhythm, technology sometimes reveals a strange and delicate personality. A device flickers for a moment. A timestamp appears in a place where it doesn't belong. A message arrives with the wrong date, as though it slipped into the present from a moment ahead or a moment behind. These experiences are small, barely noticeable in the rush of a busy day, but at night, when everything else has softened, they can feel like tiny anomalies tugging at the edge of our sense of time. Most of the time, these glitches have simple explanations. A syncing issue, an exhausted battery, a drifting clock inside a server room. Computers behave like living things with their own rhythms, sometimes waking, sometimes stuttering, sometimes forgetting instructions. And yet, every so often the glitch lands too cleanly, too perfectly timed, too oddly placed to feel entirely random. When that happens, we experience a familiar stirring, a faint sense that something is leaning through the cracks of the moment. Imagine checking your phone only to find that the time has jumped backward by a few minutes, then corrected itself instantly. Or opening a document and seeing that its last edited mark shows a date that hasn't happened yet. You blink, refresh the page, and everything returns to normal, leaving behind a moment of uncertainty. A logical voice in your mind assures you it was just a software hiccup, but another quieter voice wonders, what if? These small technology misbehaviors can be thought of as the modern equivalents of old folklore signs. Shadows moving where they shouldn't, clocks stopping at mysterious hours, candles flickering for no reason. In the past, people turned these strange moments into stories about spirits or omens. Today, we have blinking cursors and unstable Wi-Fi connections. Yet the emotional effect is the same. Something feels slightly out of line, as though the world has briefly misstepped. There is a reason such glitches capture our imagination. Technology, especially digital technology, is bound tightly to time. Our devices track minutes, store memories, coordinate schedules, and stamp every action with a precise moment. When time becomes unstable inside this digital world, even for a few seconds, it creates a sensation that is both modern and deeply ancient. The sense of standing inside a moment that doesn't quite belong. Consider, for example, the way video calls sometimes freeze. When the image locks in place and a friend's voice continues without their face moving, the effect is unsettling. It feels like time has paused in one corner of reality while continuing naturally in another. Or think of the occasional jitter in audio recordings, a small distortion, a sudden shift in pitch, like a ripple passing across an otherwise calm surface. These glitches are electrical or computational in nature, but the experience they create resembles a crease in time. Then there are the rare and baffling glitches that feel even stranger. A photo appearing twice in a gallery, even though it was taken only once. A notification appearing and disappearing so quickly you question whether you saw it. A message jumping to the top of a chat as though it had just been sent, even though it was written days ago. Most likely these are indexing errors, caching issues, or tiny lapses in the synchronization between servers. Yet the impression they leave behind is harder to place. Sometimes, even knowing the explanation doesn't stop the feeling that the moment carried a hint of something more. If we wanted to imagine temporal echoes in the digital age, soft intrusions from another point in time, glitches would be the easiest place to hide them. Not because they prove anything, but because they already exist in a liminal space. They sit between order and disorder, between precision and error, between the expected and the unexpected. They are the modern equivalent of shimmering heat on a horizon, perhaps just an illusion, but also a subtle hint that reality is more flexible than it appears. Physics gives us metaphors for this flexibility. In the smallest scales of the universe, particles fluctuate unpredictably. Light sometimes chooses paths that seem irrational until we learn to see the deeper pattern. Things that look like error from a distance may turn out to be structure up close. In the same way, a glitch in technology may simply be a moment where two processes, one slightly ahead, one slightly behind, overlap for a heartbeat, creating a small confusion in the way time is recorded. Imagine a server in one city running a fraction of a second faster than a server in another city. When they exchange information, a file may briefly display an impossible timestamp before the systems correct themselves. These fractional differences, so tiny we cannot feel them, can be seen as miniature versions of temporal mismatches, moments where time itself seems to waver, even though the cause is ordinary. Yet when your device displays something that looks out of alignment, the sensation often feels disproportionate to the scale of the glitch. It resonates because it brushes against something deeper in our minds, the sense that time is a structure we rarely question, and when it slips, even slightly, we feel the ground move under our feet. Another way to picture these glitches is to think of modern systems as giant webs, strings connected across continents. When one part shakes, even delicately, the vibration travels through the rest. Most of the time, that vibration settles quickly and invisibly, but sometimes the shake arrives at just the right moment to catch your attention, creating an impression that something unusual has occurred. These impressions are not evidence of time travel, nor do they reflect cosmic events, but they show how deeply sensitive we are to disturbances in the flow of time, even when those disturbances come from everyday technology. They remind us that our relationship with time is fragile, perceptual, and full of quiet expectations. When those expectations are broken, even softly we notice. In the context of temporal echoes, glitches play the role of small, playful distortions, tiny irregularities that make us pause and reflect. They are not glimpses of the future, but they invite the same wonder. They make us imagine what it would feel like if time was slightly looser than we believed, if moments could shift or overlap, if 1 second could reach a little too far into the next. As we drift deeper into the possibilities of time's behaviour, these technological anomalies become gentle metaphors. They remind us that even in a world built on precision and synchronization, tiny uncertainties still slip through. And if we allow ourselves a moment of imagination, these uncertainties can feel like soft invitations, little nudges to consider the quiet, intricate ways time might leave impressions on the world. When imagining a civilization far ahead of us, one that has learned to harness energies we can barely describe and navigate cosmic distances as easily as we cross a room, it is tempting to picture them surrounded by shining towers and impossible machines. But if we take a quieter, more contemplative view, a future society might not be defined by its power, but by its caution. With great advancement often comes a deeper awareness of fragility of ecosystems, of timelines, of delicate chains of cause and effect. And so, if such a society ever looked back toward us, reaching gently across the centuries, we might ask, what would they dare to risk? It begins with the simple thought that any society advanced enough to explore time would also be advanced enough to understand its dangers. They would likely know that history, like a tapestry woven with millions of threads, can unravel from a single careless tug. They would understand that even a small change, a misplaced object, a sentence spoken at the wrong moment, a person nudged slightly off course, might ripple outward in ways no one could predict. And they would know that some ripples, once formed, cannot be undone. Imagine standing at the edge of a still pond. If you dip your hand into the water, even gently, the ripples spread outward in widening circles. But if you drop a stone, the disturbance is far greater. A visitor from the future, aware of this, might choose to move through the past like a person moving across a pond at dawn, slowly, lightly, leaving as little imprint as possible. Their goal would not be to reshape the world, but to observe it, understand it, and perhaps protect it. Why would a future civilization want to touch the past at all? The reasons could be both simple and profound. Perhaps they face dangers, cosmic events, ecological collapse, or technological crises that threaten their survival. Perhaps they look back to understand how earlier societies navigated similar turning points. Or perhaps they simply seek knowledge, wanting to learn how humans once lived, laughed, and struggled in ages before theirs. In moments of such reflection, it's comforting to imagine that the future might reach back not with force, but with care, not to alter events on a grand scale, but to make small adjustments, nudges, as gentle as a breeze that guides a drifting leaf without changing the shape of the forest. For instance, suppose a future archivist discovers that an important manuscript nearly vanished because a single spark once threatened the room where it was kept. A society capable of understanding time might find a way to ensure the manuscript survives, not by extinguishing the spark, but by influencing the conditions around it. Someone might feel an inexplicable urge to close a window. A librarian might stay late and move the book to a safer place. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible. Just a tiny shift that keeps the thread of history intact. Or think of a scientist in the present who stumbles upon an idea years before its time. They may say it came to them suddenly, without a clear source. Inspiration, intuition, a stroke of insight. But perhaps, in a poetic sense, such sparks could be encouraged by a nudge from a future mind. An idea placed gently into the current moment, not as a command, but as a whisper. These nudges would never violate the flow of time. They would fit seamlessly into the world, appearing as ordinary moments, ordinary choices. The universe's rules, the ones we explored in earlier sessions, likely wouldn't allow any loud disruptions or paradoxes. But within the quiet spaces of possibility, the small decisions, the fleeting thoughts, there might be room for influence so delicate it leaves no trace. If we imagine this carefully, it feels less like manipulation and more like stewardship. A future civilization, aware of how easily history can shift, would act with humility. They might see our era not as something to correct, but as something to understand. They might observe our struggles and triumphs the way an artist studies a painting, without touching the canvas, appreciating its texture and colour, learning from its imperfections. There is also another kind of risk: emotional risk. If someone from the future were to enter the past physically, even briefly, they would feel the weight of knowing how much could change with a single interaction. They might want to speak, to share knowledge or warnings, but hold back because of the delicate balance. It is not difficult to imagine how lonely such a journey could be. To walk among one's ancestors, feeling a kinship across centuries, yet unable to reveal oneself fully. And yet, despite these risks, the idea remains quietly beautiful. It suggests a future humanity that values its origins, one that sees the past not as a place of ignorance, but as a place of wonder, a place worthy of respect, protection, and gratitude. If such a society ever reached back in time, their actions would likely reflect that reverence. Perhaps they would share a gentle nudge here or there, a passing thought that arrives at just the right moment, a spark of creativity, a sudden clarity in a confusing situation. These would not be interventions, but subtle harmonies, woven into the rhythm of life without disrupting its melody. Or perhaps they would leave no trace at all, choosing instead to watch quietly, cherishing the past from afar the way we cherish the glow of ancient starlight. We admire it, we study it, but we never try to change it. We understand its distance, we respect its story. As we drift deeper into the final part of our journey, this idea of future hands reaching gently across time becomes a foundation for imagining how chrononauts might truly behave, not as intruders or meddlers, but as caretakers of the timeline, moving softly with respect for every fragile moment. If a traveller from the future ever walked quietly among us, they would not be the kind of figure our stories often imagine. There would be no shimmering machine appearing in a flash of light, no confident stride out of a portal, no dramatic announcement of origins. Instead, the presence of a chrononaut, if such a presence could exist at all, would be subtle, almost invisible, woven into the fabric of daily life like a thread so fine you hardly notice it until you look closely. And even then, you might only sense that something about them feels slightly out of rhythm with the moment. To picture someone who moves through time with intention and caution, imagine a traveller stepping into a foreign culture, not just another country, but another era entirely. They would blend in not by mimicking every detail perfectly, but by moving gently, saying little, and observing with almost reverent care. Their goal would not be to stand out, but to disappear into the background of history, like a figure in an old painting whose face is partially turned away. One of the first things such a traveller would avoid is technology. A chrononaut carrying a device from their century would face a difficult choice. Revealing the device could distort the timeline in ways they could not predict. Even understanding how fragile the past can be, they might choose to leave all advanced tools behind, relying instead on their awareness and memory. This would make them appear almost minimalist in their habits. Calm, precise, never fumbling with objects, never checking a device, never surprised by the absence of conveniences we take for granted. A chrononaut would move with an unusual kind of self-control. They would avoid drawing attention. Their gestures would be soft, their reactions measured. They might carry themselves with a quiet confidence, an ease that comes from knowing more about the world than they could possibly reveal. Or they might seem slightly detached, as if their thoughts were anchored in another time, one that continues to whisper to them even while they stand in the present. Historical records occasionally mention individuals who seemed ahead of their time, but in a way that doesn't fit the usual pattern of genius. These are figures who appear suddenly, filled with ideas that align more with the future than with their own era, and then vanish quietly, leaving behind fewer traces than one would expect. Their works feel oddly modern. Their words carry metaphors or sensitivities that don't fit their generation. And though it's easy to explain these anomalies as coincidence or rare intuition, there is something quietly enticing about imagining that one or two of them could have been visitors moving gently through the centuries. A chrononaut living in the past would take extraordinary care to avoid creating paradoxes. They would avoid altering major events and avoid interactions that might shift the course of history, even in small ways. Instead, they might focus on quiet acts of kindness, helping someone find a lost object, offering a calm word in a moment of distress, or preventing a minor accident unnoticed by everyone else. These gestures would be meaningful but subtle, the kind of influence that feels like chance rather than interference. Picture someone standing at a marketplace in the early morning centuries ago. They pause near a stall where a merchant absent-mindedly stacks fragile pottery near the edge. A small crowd moves by, and a child bumps against the table just hard enough to topple the stack. Before the pottery can fall, the traveller steps forward, steadying it with the lightest touch. The merchant thanks them, unaware that this gesture prevented not only broken pottery, but perhaps a chain of small events that would have rippled through the day. The traveller moves on, blending into the crowd. Nothing dramatic happened, yet something was gently preserved. Or imagine a chrononaut in a quiet library long ago, noticing that a manuscript has been placed too close to a candle. Without drawing attention, they slide it a few inches away before continuing their walk. No one sees them do it. No one would imagine that this small act prevented a fire that might have altered which story survived into the future. The chrononaut leaves no trace. Their influence becomes part of the fabric of ordinary life. These small acts would be their signature, not bold footprints, but gentle impressions that blend into history. The traveller would understand that even a single conversation could shift emotions, alliances, or choices in unpredictable ways. So instead of engaging deeply, they would listen more than they speak, observe more than they act. They would allow history to unfold naturally, stepping in only to correct the tiniest imbalances, like someone smoothing the edge of a wrinkled page so that the story can continue without distraction. There is also the question of loneliness. A chrononaut living among people who have never known their world would carry the weight of separation. They might smile more softly, their eyes lingering on details that others overlook. Patterns of architecture, the pacing of daily life, the way light falls differently in an era untouched by modern technologies. They would move like someone both present and distant, as though listening to a melody no one else can hear. This subtle detachment might be the only visible hint of their origin. A traveller from the future would walk through the past with heightened awareness, appreciating the fragility of each moment. They might look at a street or a field or a gathering and feel a deep tenderness for it, knowing how much will change in the centuries ahead. Their presence would be marked not by technological wonder, but by a quiet reverence, a sense that everything around them is worth observing, preserving, and respecting. If such a traveller ever existed, their footprints would be almost impossible to find. Not because they tried to erase them, but because they would have taken each step with such care that the ground barely felt the pressure. And perhaps that is the most beautiful idea of all, that a chrononaut, if real, would move not as a conqueror of time, but as a guest in it, gentle, thoughtful, and almost invisible. Their legacy, if any, would not be found in documents or artifacts, but in the small harmony they maintained. A candle unspilled, a pottery stack saved, a lost manuscript spared, a moment preserved. The kind of actions that leave no history, yet enrich the world all the same. There are nights when you lie awake for a little longer than usual, staring at the ceiling or listening to the rhythm of your own breathing, and a quiet question drifts into your thoughts. How much of my life is chosen? And how much is already shaped by forces I cannot see? It is a question as old as humanity itself. Philosophers, poets, and dreamers have all felt its presence. This gentle curiosity about whether our choices are entirely our own, or whether some parts of life unfold with the inevitability of a story already written. And when we imagine temporal echoes, whispers from the future brushing softly against the present, this question becomes even more delicate. like touching the surface of a still pond with the tip of your finger. To ease into this exploration, imagine life as a winding path through a quiet forest. You walk it step by step, choosing where to turn, where to slow down, where to rest. Yet the path itself has its own contours, slopes that encourage you forward, clearings that invite pause, and narrow passages where choices seem fewer. Your freedom is real, but you move through a landscape shaped long before you arrived. In the same way, our lives seem to follow patterns influenced by countless threads. Our memories, our surroundings, the people we meet, and the hidden architecture of time itself. If temporal echoes exist, soft impressions drifting from the future into the present, they would add another layer to this landscape. Not a layer of control, but a layer of resonance. A faint suggestion that certain moments might be gently nudged into alignment, not as commands, but as harmonies. Perhaps this is why some events in life feel strangely inevitable, as though we are stepping into footprints laid out just before we arrive. The Novikov principle, which we explored earlier through soft imagery, suggests that time may naturally avoid contradictions, folding itself into shapes that maintain coherence. But rather than viewing this as a strict rule, we can think of it as a form of gentle determinism, soft enough not to bind us, yet present enough to shape the flow of events, like a river guiding the current while still allowing every droplet its own path. Consider a moment when you made a decision that felt both surprising and utterly natural. You might look back and think, "Of course I chose that. It couldn't have been any other way." But at the time, the decision felt open. You weighed possibilities, felt the tug of intuition, and stepped forward. If the fabric of time encourages certain outcomes, it may do so through feelings like this, an inner sense of direction, a quiet pull toward one path over another. In many cultures, this feeling is described as destiny, not the harsh destiny of myths where everything is preordained, but a softer version, one that acknowledges free will while also recognizing patterns larger than any individual. A person might say that certain meetings were meant to be, or that some life events felt like turning points, moments where everything aligned with surprising clarity. These are poetic ways of describing what could, in a more scientific sense, be resonance within time structure. Now imagine that future moments too have their own resonance. They exist in potential, waiting to unfold, and perhaps in ways we do not fully understand, they exert a faint pull on the present, not shaping choices directly, but influencing the emotional landscape in which those choices arise. A writer suddenly feels compelled to begin a story they've been avoiding. A traveller changes their route for reasons they can't explain. A scientist rethinks a theory during a morning walk guided by an intuition that seems too timely to be random. None of these moments break the rules of causality. They don't reveal the future or interfere with it. They simply whisper, nudging thoughts gently, the way a breeze might guide a falling leaf toward one side of the path rather than the other. If this is true, then free will remains intact. Our choices remain ours, but the future participates in shaping the emotional currents that flow through us. This creates a picture of time that is neither rigid nor chaotic. It is something in between, a self-correcting story where contradictions dissolve and patterns strengthen themselves. Your experiences, your decisions, and your actions all contribute to these patterns, but they may also be influenced by echoes from what is yet to come. In this view, destiny is not a script, but a conversation between past, present, and future. One way to understand this is through the imagery of music. Think of your life as a melody you are composing in real time. Each note is your choice, each pause, your reflection, each leap in pitch, your leap of faith. But beneath your melody lies a softer harmony, the underlying structure of time. The harmony does not dictate your notes, but it provides a setting in which certain notes sound sweeter, certain rhythms feel natural, and certain transitions unfold with graceful ease. You can play as you wish, but some phrases seem to want to appear. If a traveller from the future were observing your life, they would see both layers: the melody you create moment by moment, and the harmony provided by the timeline's consistency. They would see how choices form loops of meaning, how events fold into one another, and how the future sometimes leans back with the gentlest touch, encouraging the melody to stay in tune. This soft determinism does not rob life of agency. It enriches it. It suggests that your decisions matter not only because they shape your future, but because they resonate across the fabric of time, contributing to the coherence of the entire story. It suggests that even when events feel difficult or uncertain, there may be a subtle alignment guiding the flow, helping the narrative remain whole. As we approach the final moments of this journey into temporal echoes, this idea becomes a comforting lens. If the universe protects its coherence and allows only gentle influences across time, then perhaps our lives are held within a structure that values harmony. We are free to choose, and the future is free to whisper. And somewhere between those freedoms, reality folds softly, creating a world that feels both guided and open, both mysterious and intimately ours. There is a moment near the end of any long journey when the world seems to exhale. The pace slows, the thoughts that once crowded your mind soften into something gentler, and the landscape, whether real or imagined, takes on the calm glow of late evening. As we reach the final steps of our exploration into temporal echoes, this same quiet settles around us. The ideas we've followed, loops within loops, soft nudges from the future, dreams that arrive early, and glitches that feel like ripples across time, now gather in a warm, subdued circle, inviting us to pause and simply notice, not to conclude, not to solve, just to notice. If there is a single thread running through every part of our journey, it is the recognition that time is far more delicate and mysterious than our daily schedules allow us to feel. We move through hours and days as though they are sturdy and predictable, but beneath that familiarity lies a landscape of gentle folds and shifting textures. And when you begin to sense those folds, when you start paying attention to the small deviations, the quiet coincidences, the strangely timed thoughts, you find yourself stepping into a way of seeing that is both calming and strangely profound. Imagine sitting beside a window at dusk, the world outside fading into blue. The air grows cooler, and the sounds of the day soften into muted echoes. A distant car passes. A bird calls once before settling in for the night. Everything slows, but nothing stops. In that moment, time feels less like a line and more like a presence. Something living, something breathing, something that moves around you rather than dragging you forward. It is in moments like these that temporal echoes become easiest to perceive, not as visions or messages, but as feelings, a sense that something in the present holds a faint resonance from another moment. Past or future, it hardly matters. A decision that comes to you with unexpected clarity, a memory that returns with surprising relevance, a coincidence that feels like a quiet reminder, nudging you toward reflection rather than explanation. You might begin to notice the subtle details of life, the way a particular word appears in conversation, then in a book, then in a dream, the way a stranger's passing glance feels oddly familiar, the way a thought forms just before someone else speaks it aloud. These are not signs of anything dramatic. They are simply parts of the intricate weaving that makes up the lived experience of time, the gentle patterns that form when moments echo one another in ways too soft to measure. Part of recognizing these echoes is accepting their ambiguity. In a world that constantly seeks certainty, ambiguity can feel unsettling. But ambiguity is also spacious. It leaves room for curiosity, imagination, and calm. When you let yourself observe without rushing to explain, you begin to experience time in a way that feels almost like listening. Listening to the present, listening to your own mind, listening to the delicate hum of existence flowing through and around you. Some people call this mindfulness, some call it intuition, others simply call it awareness. But whatever name you choose, it is a practice of noticing how moments align, noticing how thoughts arrive, noticing how the world feels when you slow down enough to sense its subtleties. If temporal echoes exist, and we have explored many ways they might, then perhaps they are not loud or dramatic for a reason. Perhaps the universe prefers to offer them as opportunities rather than instructions. Moments to pause, moments to wonder, moments to feel connected to something larger than the immediate present, something that stretches across lifetimes, across centuries, across the unbroken thread of time itself. And even if these echoes come from nowhere but your own mind, from memory, from intuition, from the quiet logic of your inner life, they still hold value. Because in noticing them, you become more attuned to your own presence in the world, more aware of the delicate rhythm of your thoughts, more grounded in the feeling that time is not a force pushing you forward, but a companion walking beside you. So as we come to the closing moments of this journey, let this be a gentle invitation. Observe the world with a little more softness. Notice the moments that feel slightly out of rhythm, not as signs of anything supernatural, but as openings through which you can see more deeply. Allow yourself to lean into the wonder of time, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as an atmosphere to inhabit. Let the small mysteries remain small. Let the big mysteries remain grand. And let yourself drift into the comfort of knowing that you are part of something vast, connected by threads stretching far beyond your immediate horizon. If you ever find yourself lying awake again, listening to the quiet movements of the night, you might think back to these explorations. You might notice the way your thoughts drift between past and future with such natural ease, and realize that even within one night, time behaves more gently than it first appears. The future is not a distant place. It is a possibility unfolding with every breath. The past is not gone. It is a soft shadow resting behind every step, and your life, moving between them, is a bridge woven from memory, hope, and presence. As this journey settles into its final breath, take a moment to let your mind loosen. Feel the quiet around you, like a blanket draped across the day's remaining thoughts. Let your eyes grow heavy, if they wish. Let your breathing slow, and allow the echoes of time, whatever they are, wherever they come from, to accompany you into rest.